One of the rising faces of the new right, especially in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, is Nick Fuentes. Now, Fuentes himself isn't a new figure in online politics. I've spoken about him a few times here and there. I think most recently in my Wife Guys video from back at the start of the year, which to be honest, is actually a somewhat related topic to what we're talking about today. Nick Fuentes first blew up back in 2017 as a fresh-faced 18-year-old who was one of the many people identified as having attended the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. He claimed back then that he dropped out of university after receiving death threats for what he called normal center-right beliefs. But just like Anita Sarkeesian before him, I don't think he ever actually produced proof of those death threats. In retrospect, it looks like Fuentes might have been one of the first people to attempt the now tried and true formula of claiming you've been cancelled by the online left and then turning that into an influencer career, which to be fair does happen sometimes, but it's also just as often manufactured by right-wingers who are looking to boost their own careers. Like, for example, that one lady recently who's currently running around claiming that she's suffering religious discrimination by her trans professor because she wrote an essay for class in defense of Christian values, when in actuality, her essay just fucking sucked. In any case, after Charlottesville, Nick Fuentes convinced his parents, who he was still living with at the time, to let him bum around the family house for a while and try to make a career out of the whole streaming thing. Personally, I recall him appearing on my radar back during the old Bloodsports era of 2017 and 2018. You know what I mean, right? Warski, Tonka Saw, Ralph Retort, Nebraska-era Destiny. In fact, I even have a memory of him calling himself a classical liberal to disguise his more extreme views, allowing him to slip in alongside people like Sargon, who actually was a liberal at that time. Although Millennial Woes, a different white nationalist influencer that I spoke about recently, has got to be in his mid-40s at this point, while Fuentes is 27, I think, the two of them are cut from the same cloth. They hold similar views, and for a while they operated mask on in order to stealth into liberal spaces and move people rightward. Nick Fuentes' political group, known as America First, or more colloquially the Groypers, fell into a period of hibernation after January 6th, like many other dissident right movements. And like the rest of them, he's also seen a huge resurgence ever since the 2024 American presidential election cycle, when it became clear that Trump was going to get away with his crimes, and MAGA was unfortunately not going to get dismantled, despite, all the evidence being right fucking there. The reason that we're talking about Nick Fuentes today, though, is that in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death, he's actually been able to successfully position himself as a mainstream face of the American right for the first time in his 8-year career, despite holding views that the former mainstream of the right, and even Trump himself sometimes, consider to be abhorrent. When it comes to Jews and Holocaust denial, and ethnic groups in America, that sort of thing. The crazy leftoids like to pretend that the American right was simply racist and conspiratorial to the core this entire time and that was it. But that's not true. The neocons of 10 or 20 years ago were not cut from the same cloth as the new right of today.
There are some isms that occasionally pop up. One is isolationism, and its evil twin protectionism, and its evil triplet nativism. So if you study the 20s, for example, there was an American First policy that said, who cares what happens in Europe? Well, what happened in Europe mattered. Eventually, because of World War II. There was Smoot-Hawley, which was a part of an economic policy, which basically said we don't want trade. In other words, let's throw up barriers. And there was an immigration policy that I think during this period argued we had too many Jews and too many Italians, therefore we should have no immigrants. And my point to you is we've been through this kind of period of isolationism, protectionism, nativism. I'm a little concerned that we may be going through the same period.
Which brings us to the other half of this conversation, a guy that we can accurately identify as a boomer neocon himself, Piers Morgan. Morgan's had a very successful career in mainstream conservative media. He worked at The Sun, The Daily Mirror, CNN with Piers Morgan Live, he co-hosted Good Morning Britain. He eventually settled into his current gig, hosting Piers Morgan Uncensored, first on Talk TV, and now independently on YouTube. He's a multi-millionaire, owning 3 mansions in London, East Sussex, and Beverly Hills. Being a boomer neocon, he's no friend to socialism or insane woke progressivism, but nonetheless he moved away from Trump after his increasingly erratic public statements during the COVID pandemic throughout 2020, and he entirely disavowed him after January 6th. With all of that background laid out, let's talk about the actual event. On December 8th, 2025, Piers Morgan hosted Nick Fuentes on his show, and the conversation went about as you'd expect. I first went into this topic during my Goonergate video, but things have rapidly accelerated since then. You have the boomer neocons, we might call them right-wing liberals. These people used to make up the mainstream right in a lot of Western countries. Their thought leaders and talking heads are guys like Piers Morgan and Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay. These guys fundamentally still believe in the core values of liberalism. You know what I mean. Free speech, free association, free markets, free trade, free travel, equality before the law, all that sort of thing. Capitalism and individual liberty. The second faction in the right-wing split is the dissident right. Their thought leaders and talking heads are guys like Nick Fuentes, and Curtis Yarvin, and Aaron McIntyre, and Sargon, who moved into that position around 5 years ago. These guys actually have very different political views sometimes, but what unites them is that they reject liberal presuppositions, meaning they're not like the neocons, who still view that freedom of speech, free markets, equality before the law, etc. as good things, while simply disagreeing with the center-left's interpretation of them. Rather, the dissident right rejects those liberal values from the get-go. In fact, they view those values as being the source of the problems in the West. That old Goonergate stuff from a year ago was really the canary in the coal mine for the current right-wing split. You had the Gooners, the right-wing liberals, who were sticking up for the individualistic right of adults to enjoy sexually exciting content, which they had previously defended from left-wing feminist Puritans who hated the male gaze, but now you also have the right-wing religious Puritans, who view sexual content as degenerate and against their religious values. The Gooners called these people the woke right, because they operated like the woke left. They were imposing right-wing morality rather than left-wing morality, but they were still imposing it. And although woke right is a stupid name, it ended up sticking. And eventually it trickled out of the gaming space into mainstream politics, largely through James Lindsay. As a result, the right-wing liberals came to view the dissident right as the woke right, for infringing on those individualistic liberal freedoms, the same way the left does. And the dissident right came to view the right-wing liberals as also the woke right, because to them, those individualistic liberal freedoms are considered leftist. Understanding all of this, it becomes very easy to predict how the Piers Morgan versus Nick Fuentes conversation actually went. Piers performed very badly, about as well as Mehdi Hasan did during the talk with that one kid who just kept saying, "Yeah, I'm a fascist, so what? What are you gonna do about it?" Piers kept saying shit like, "So Nick, you admit you're a racist." And Nick Fuentes kept saying, "Yeah, so what? Who cares?" When your entire form of argumentation is simply trying to get your opponent to admit that they are a thing that you disagree with, when your opponent doesn't actually care about that kind of moral outrage, it turns out you don't actually win the argument. In fact, you haven't even presented an argument. You've simply said, "Haha, I win because he said he is the thing I think is bad." The win condition of this debate is to go mask off, right? This is why Mehdi Hasan lost his debate, and it's why Piers Morgan lost this one. Now, if you guys think that I'm fluffing Nick Fuentes here, I'm not. I'm really not. I dislike both of these guys for different reasons. And let's go over both of those reasons by examining this exchange.
Just to clear up one of the many theories about you, I've no idea what the answer is and you haven't got to answer. But are you actually attracted to women?
I am attracted to women.
You're not gay?
No. But I will say that women are very difficult to be around.
Okay.
So there's that.
And do you think they should have the right to vote?
I do not. No, absolutely not.
They should stay at home?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
So basically, you're just a misogynist old dinosaur, aren't you? For a young guy.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I'm the boomer. I know I'm the boomer here, but actually, you're a 27-year-old dinosaur, aren't you? Aren't you, Nick Fuentes? All women.
I am.
All women are annoying. All women grow old. They all get fat. Says the guy. Have you ever had sex?
No, absolutely not.
Wow. Says the guy who's never got laid.
Now, Piers is correct here. Nick Fuentes is a virgin. He famously has a complex about women, and it's to his detriment, because whenever he actually talks to a woman, he is clearly out of his element. His conversation with Candace Owens comes to mind. Plus, there's the whole, well, I'll just let him describe for himself his concept of virginity.
A man and a woman have sex, and they have a kid. A guy and a guy cannot have sex. It cannot happen. Cannot, I mean, you can make it work in the sense that you can sort of like hump an orifice in the same way that you could have sex with a pumpkin. You can have sex with watermelon. You have sex with, anything really, right? If you're talking about friction, you're talking about mechanical dynamics here.
However, I really don't think it should be Piers fucking Morgan taking Nick to task over this topic, because Piers himself isn't exactly a bastion of giga-chad masculinity when it comes to experience with women either. When he met his wife, Celia Walden, it was after he had bombed a speech, and she was openly mocking him, which for some reason he thought made her wife material. She publicly posts stuff like, "Do I really want to have a picture with this guy?" And "Being married to him is like one very long eye roll. I'm sad because I wake up every morning with him staring back at me. Please someone give him a job." Now, this can be explained as the two of them just doing some public banter. Maybe this is just their sense of humor, fair enough. This isn't evidence on its own that Piers is some kind of henpecked cuck who doesn't wear the pants in his relationship, even though she says she wears the pants, but whatever. However, after the Nick Fuentes interview, the Groypers did their dig ops, as they always do, and they discovered that Piers' relationship appears to be somewhat one-sided beyond just simple jokes. It looks like he's far more enraptured with her than she is with him. In a lot of their public photos, he's quite happy, while she only seems to be kinda tolerating his presence. And then the Groypers begin to dig up her Instagram posts, where she's intimately posing with other men. Sometimes it's other celebrities, sometimes it's just the hired help when Mr. Husband's away. Like, imagine publicly posting, "Oh, Oswald, behave," while being married. When she does post stuff about her husband, it's usually demeaning or emasculating towards him. Again, this can all be explained as simple banter. Maybe they're both okay with her online presence denigrating their relationship. At the end of the day, that's up to them. But then it came out that she has an account on Ashley Madison, the online dating service specifically for married people to have affairs with. And then it was dug up that she credits a 6-week break from their marriage with reviving it, during which she totally wasn't fucking anybody else, I'm sure. Now listen, if Piers Morgan and Celia Walden want their relationship to be structured this way, that's no skin off my back, you do you. If she's actually just cheating on him and he's okay with it, that's between them, it's none of my business. But when Piers Morgan is attacking Nick Fuentes for his lack of experience with women, which is entirely true on Nick's part, he's doing so by specifically taking up the position of the guy who actually knows women, who is sexually successful in a heteronormative way. Basically, Piers is trying to be the Chad laughing at the virgin for being a virgin, but that dynamic assumes that Piers is himself following the basic heterosexual success story of being the dominant leader in his relationship, which, as we've seen, he probably actually isn't.
Wow.
That's the thing, though. You boomers, it's
you
always
think you're an expert
get laid,
in women,
free love.
given you've never got laid?
Yeah, we are going back to the Stone Age. You're absolutely right. This. You know, you're talking about empathy and your kids are empathetic and they would never laugh at a joke about the Holocaust and you're a misogynist. You're a simp yourself. You're totally henpecked. That's the problem.
All that being said, though, this doesn't mean that Nick Fuentes is correct about anything in this conversation either. He's not. Piers was unequipped to handle his arguments, and his fallback tactic of calling him a virgin like we're all still in high school was pretty embarrassing. But none of that means that Nick or the Groypers are actually correct on the things that they say. The interview itself was largely a hit piece. There's not much in the way of actual arguments to talk about in the video, with the exception of very simple stuff like Holocaust denial is wrong, not simply for moral reasons, but because we also have extensive documentation of the event, and the dissident right's view of it is simply factually false, you know, that sort of thing. In fact, there's actually more to talk about if you go look at the Groypers, who watched this interview and felt that Nick Fuentes nailed it. Here's a clip made by a Fuentes follower from a video titled Gen Z Doesn't Care Anymore, which I found to be interesting.
Boomers can't even imagine the possibility of somebody unashamedly calling themselves a racist, misogynist, or being complimentary to Hitler in any context. Given the unbelievable ideological disparity, I would suspect that there isn't even one blue-pilled boomer who was persuaded by Fuentes' performance and arguments at all. Just as I highly doubt a single red-pilled Zoomer thought Piers did anything other than embarrass himself. These perspectives have become irreconcilable. Boomers are just entirely incapable of viewing these topics objectively. But the Zoomers have now effectively learned how to detach themselves from our ingrained culture. We have an ability to divorce the grave, serious nature of topics from this histrionic response. We can still respond to things with serious action, but it doesn't require this acting component to ensure everyone knows just how much we disapprove.
What he's basically saying is that right-wing Gen Z men no longer feel a need to performatively virtue signal whenever a boomer snaps his fingers. Like, yes, the Holocaust was bad, but do we really need to constantly reaffirm it anytime we're going to discuss these topics? Is the action of discussing the topics themselves a step too far? After all, some progressives say it is. And this guy is correct to point out that not just Gen Z, but everybody is tired of performative virtue signaling. They're tired of cancel culture. They're tired of walking around on their tiptoes. We were tired of it back during the SJW era. It's the main reason why the anti-SJWs became a thing. But just like the split between the right-wing liberals and the dissident right, there are two factions in this conversation. There's the people who are tired of performative virtue signaling, and they just want a space for open, rational discussion. And then there's people who want to replace the performative virtue signaling with, for lack of a better term, performative vice signaling. It's one thing to get annoyed at having to constantly reiterate that Nazis are bad while trying to discuss the Holocaust in an objective manner, all the while progressives call you a Nazi anyway, but it's another thing entirely to go mask on and pretend to desire that objective conversation when your actual position is real Holocaust denial, and you only value that open space insofar as you can subvert it.
How many rapes has Piers Morgan's ideology cost? How much devastation and evil has been done all in the name of exotic restaurants being available? We have watched the boomers continually showcase dramatic Facebook posts condemning something, yet taken no action to truly correct it. In fact, it's now clear that Gen Z cares to a far higher degree than the boomers. We actually care so much about the important things that it allows us to shed the superficiality of all these retarded labels. We care about action and outcomes, not the labels that come with an uncomfortable opinion. We're called racist, while immigrants literally flood Western countries and rape white children. We find that far more offensive than any word. Whatever it takes to stop that, we will do it.
You know what? When it comes to immigrants that don't align with liberal values, I actually agree. This progressive openness and this belief that everyone is fundamentally the same, it does ultimately fail when you're confronted with, say, a group of Muslim families that come into the West and continue to practice female genital mutilation, or they beat their daughters to death for having sex outside of marriage, or their sons for being gay. When the values of immigrant cultures come into conflict with liberal values need to win out, and progressives are far too permissive with the cultural relativism bullshit. But once again, the problem with the Groypers is that they're just factually wrong. Time and again, the numbers keep showing that various immigrant groups tend to commit less crime than your average American or European. Obviously, that doesn't excuse immigrants who actually do commit crime. Absolutely not. They must be punished, and no amount of cultural relativism should ever save them. We can critique left-wing over-permissiveness without falling into right-wing lies and conspiracy theories. When this guy says that Gen Z doesn't care anymore, I mean, he's talking about right-wing Gen Z, but okay, he's actually correct. The right has hit its Menefrego moment, where it no longer cares about rational arguments, because it usually loses them. It no longer cares about good reasons not to do things, it simply wants to do them anyway. This is the populist curse, whether left or right. A lack of knowledge about why things are the way they are leads people to believe that things should be a different way, and they don't even know why they're wrong. A lack of education makes all systems opaque, and opaqueness is easily mistaken for corruption. At the end of the day, guys like Nick and his followers do sometimes have good critiques of the current system, but their solutions would overwhelmingly make everything worse. Back at the start of the video, I mentioned the whole wife guy thing, where there was a previous drama cycle where Nick Fuentes made fun of right-wing men who had no revolutionary potential. They simply wanted to get married and have kids and live a normal life. One of the reasons the right is not predisposed to revolution is because a good chunk of right-wingers want to live average, family-focused lives. Their political theory is all about religion and tradition. They aren't naturally oriented towards political greatness. Another white nationalist, Richard Spencer, said something similar. This is going to be a long clip, but it does have a point.
I think a lot of Groypers resent the wife jack because it's something that is very difficult to acquire at this point in time, and it was easier. Now, it was always sort of hard, but it was simply easier to live in the 1950s and just roll in to some 30-year employment and, you know, a wife, 2.5 kids, a television set, etc. Now, we sort of have a misty, nostalgic, inaccurate, in many ways, view of the 1950s, but I get it. You didn't have student loan debt. You didn't, housing was certainly more affordable in comparison to your income than it is now. At least with the Groypers, there's at least a potential for something higher and bigger. Because I hate to break it to these conservatives and infotards and alt-light influencers, etc., but wife jack ain't it. Wife jack is not an ideal. Wife jack doesn't accomplish anything. I saw one meme as I glanced at Twitter today at the water. I mean, I was doing wife jack-like activities just today, the water park, of the you know, some Chad who's like, we're Chad and wife jack, like, we're trying to save the white race by having children. Let me break the news to you, folks. The 1950s was followed by another decade called the 1960s. So apparently, wife jack offered zero resistance, meaningful resistance, to the flow of the sexual revolution, integration, the Hart-Celler Act, I could go, free and easy drug use. I could just go on and on. So you're clearly not saving the white race. Wife jack and company went to church more often. Wife Jack and company had higher birth rates during the post-war period, immediate post-war period, and we still had all of these problems that the entire right agrees are problems that they endlessly complain about. So Wife Jack is not an ideal. You're not really saving the white race. You are, in fact, breeding for more conservatards, and in fact, you're breeding for liberals, most likely. Wife Jack is ultimately not terribly interesting if her appreciation of the finer things in life include Target, Starbucks, and Marvel films. She's actually not aspirational. She's kind of totally cringe, if inoffensive on some level. She doesn't really accomplish anything. You had Wife Jack supremacy at one point in American history, and we still ended up here. So what are you talking about? You're clearly not saving the white race by lionizing your boring, annoying wife. I'm sorry. And the fact that you don't really have any ideal other than leave us alone so that we can all wife jack in peace in our minivan while we drive the kiddos to Target and I buy my wife Jack a $7 latte on the road. If that is your political ideal, like I saw some other replies that were getting like tons of retweet, you know, like, this is literally what I aspire to. You're fucking pathetic if that's what you aspire to. That's something you should look down upon. That's kind of like the worst aspect of the bourgeoisie, of being middle class, basically.
I apologize for subjecting you to like 5 whole minutes of Richard Spencer, but I want you to understand that the revolutionary right hates the sort of quasi-libertarian, quasi-liberal, live-and-let-live tendency of the center-right family man, who has no aspirations beyond working hard at a decent job, having some kids, and passing on a legacy. In fact, the revolutionary right hates that sort of middle-class complacency, for a lot of the same reasons as the revolutionary left. Sargon said much the same thing in his video, "Weakness is not a virtue."
I just hate the middle class. I really, really despise them. And I really mean it as well. There is a particular kind of cowardice in the middle class. A snivelling conformity and a false sense of morality that underpins absolutely everything they say and do. And it's all predicated on the idea that, actually guys, I'm harmless, therefore I'm a good person. No, you're a fucking pussy. That's what you are. You're a fucking pussy. And I'm sick of it. I am absolutely sick of it. I'm sick of the equating weakness with goodness. I'm absolutely tired of it. Weakness does not equal goodness. It means nothing. It means you have no agency. It means you are not good nor bad. You are as moral as a stone or a tree. You have no morality if you are too weak to take any kind of action. Morality consists in the positive action you take, not in the lack of action that you don't take. My God, do I fucking hate the bourgeoisie and all of their moral framework. They're so morally stunted. It just drives me crazy. They don't understand that they're sat there with their soft hands and their fucking like IPA beers going, well, I mean, I think the right things, therefore I'm a good person. It's like, no, that makes you a fucking sheep.
Now, like I said earlier, these guys all represent different factions within the dissident right. Spencer is a white nationalist, Fuentes a Christian nationalist, Sargon a post-liberal. In fact, Sargon debated these guys back when he was still a liberal. Despite their differing views on race, what aligns them all now is their rejection of liberal morality and their hatred of the family and consumption-oriented, introspection-less middle class that liberalism's created. The critique here is, the center-right, the normie right, can never truly revolt against the system, because the limit of right-wing desire is to have a dad bod, drive around town in a minivan full of kids, and go to Costco and Starbucks and the theater with their family. Their political engagement only goes so far as to allow them to live this sort of middle-class lifestyle. They're not actually capable of revolting against the system beyond that. And this is not some new insight of the 21st century dissident right or something. That well-known previous wave of right-wing extremism, 20th century fascism, came to much the same conclusions. Hitler hated the old conservative order of Germany for being too permissive of the degeneracy of the Weimar period. Mussolini despised the fact that despite the fascist party coming to power, it was still within a monarchical system, and pledged to one day have a second fascist revolution to depose the king and wash away the remaining traces of the old order. The French fascist, Robert Brasillach, famously stated that the liberal right, the regimist right, was their most despised enemy, not the socialists. He called them the old cuckolds of the right, declaring that the enemies of national restoration are not only on the left, but first and foremost on the right. The point of this is not to say that today's dissident right are the same as yesteryear's fascists, though it is kinda telling that these guys use the epithet cuckservative in a similar way. But rather it's to point out that the extremist right fucking despises the moderate right. If they're able to subvert and radicalize center-right normies, they'll do it. But if those normies refuse to be subverted and radicalized, they become the ultimate enemy, more so than their true opposition. By the way, the radical left operates this way as well. The socialists view liberals as future converts, and if they refuse to radicalize, they turn on them with a hatred greater than what they have for the right. What's actually happening here on both sides is that the existence of moderates actually shows the system is working. If there are just naturally more extremists, it's because the system's failing. Therefore, if their radicalization efforts are failing, it's evidence that their worldview is fundamentally incorrect. Here's some food for thought. If all of those good, wholesome, pro-social behaviors are sequestered off into the cuckservative right, what kind of lives do these radicalized right-wingers actually lead? Does it sound like anything you'd actually want to be? Like, check this out. This guy is a groiper and a former incel who finally got a girlfriend and posted this picture of them together. It went viral back during the summer. He got so much fucking hate from his community for this very normal thing of just getting on with real life and taking the first steps out of being a terminally online brain-rotted culture-warring right-wing revolutionary. It was actually incredible to watch unfold in real time just how much hate this guy received for simply moving on. If you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed by now that a good chunk of the dissident right actually hates conservatives and family values, because from their point of view, pairing off with a woman and moving into the husband and father stage of life is emasculating. It means you have a stake in the stability of the current system, and therefore you're less likely to overthrow it. I don't think Sargon falls into this camp, being a family man himself, but his critique is at least somewhat in line with guys like Fuentes, or Spencer, or even Andrew Tate, who absolutely despise the average conservative for lacking any revolutionary potential. The goal of these guys is to make you as radicalized as possible. They don't actually want you finding a girlfriend and moving on with your life. They want you to be a foot soldier. They want you blackpilled. They want you believing you'll never make it, because that's how they can convince you to overthrow the system they hate, even though it turns out the system's actually pretty good, despite its flaws. And that is what I ultimately took away from this interview. Piers Morgan is an idiot, a dinosaur from a previous political paradigm, who doesn't understand that simply shaming your opponent does not refute arguments, who doesn't understand that the rules of the game are no longer performing an intricate dance, trying to make your opponent look like they're related to the villains of World War II. However, Nick Fuentes is evil. The new world he wants to usher in would only cause destruction, without actually solving any of the problems he wants to solve, real or invented. He lies, he exaggerates, he subverts. Piers might be a dumb cuck, but Fuentes is the enemy that must be stopped.